The Bulls and Raptors are set to face off in the play-in game this Wednesday night in Toronto, and I went back and rewatched the game that they played against each other on February 28th when the Raptors had Jakob Poeltl, the Bulls had Pat Bev, to see what to expect. Here's my preview. The first thing that I wanted to see was what the defensive coverages were for both of these teams. The Raps guarded DeRozan and Levine really well due to the strategy that they employed, which I fully expect them to repeat again for this playing game. Both players had pretty quiet games by their standards. Levine was 6 of 12, 17 points, 3 assists, 2 turnovers, and if you haven't been watching him recently, he's been one of the best players in the second half of the season, really turned his game up since having a knee injury that slowed him down in the beginning of the season. And DeRozan was quiet in this game too. He was 5 of 11, 13 points, 2 assists, 3 turnovers. The way the Raps quieted those two guys down is they just sent a ton of bodies every single time those two guys touched it. And their plan was basically to force those guys to pass it off and live with the other Bulls role players beating them. The way they did this specifically was that they would send a hard double into the post whenever DeRozan got it in there on ball screens. They would send two guys with hard hedges to get the ball out of his hands. They chose to be comfortable with rotation. And the reason for that is that the Bulls shooters just can't punish that kind of scheme. Now, the one area where the Bulls might have some success against this defensive strategy is to take advantage of Nikola Vucevic pick and pops, because when the Raptors send two at Levine or DeRozan, they can't recover out to Vucevic. So he's going to be open for those shots. He's a 35% three-point shooter. He's just going to need to take those, a lot of those, and hit them at a decent rate. Vucevic is also a really good option in the post for the Bulls because Poeltl is a good defender. Poeltl does a good job on Vucevic, but the Raptors were switching Siakam and Poeltl, and Siakam just doesn't have the strength to hold up in that matchup as well as Poeltl. So Vucevic was doing pretty well in this game that I watched. I also found it interesting that in the second half of this game, both teams dialed down that aggression. Both teams went more to just straight switching 1 through 5, which is more conservative. It doesn't put your defense in rotation as much. You're not going to give up as many threes. But the Raptors also did something very interesting in the fourth where they switched it back up. They ramped that aggression way, way back up by sending hard doubles. So I think that that's something that we can probably see in this next matchup where there's probably going to be some halftime adjustments and the defensive coverages are not going to stay the same. The other really interesting matchup from this game is the Bulls play a pretty small starting lineup, whereas the Raptors have a ton of size throughout their lineup. So that meant that Alex Caruso, who is 6'4", had to guard Pascal Siakam, much bigger player. That gave the Bulls a lot of problems because Caruso, while he is good at guarding up, for whatever reason, he just didn't have that same level of success against Siakam. Look at this duck-in from Siakam where he knows he can take it to Caruso, so he gets that quick post-up, and Caruso had to foul him. Another play that the Raptors used a lot to get Siakam an advantage against Caruso was an Iverson cut. He can get the ball on one side, isolate, just back Caruso down, and the Bulls just couldn't stop that. The Bulls were reading, which means switching 1 through 4, so Patrick Beverley would also get that Siakam matchup. And again, Pat Bev is just too small to guard Siakam. But those were the best options that the Bulls had. I would not be surprised if they opt to change their starting lineup and put Patrick Williams in instead, because he does have more size to guard Siakam, and he did a much better job on that matchup. So the Bulls have built this really good defense by playing Vucevic up to touch. What that means is he is playing very high up at the level of the screen, and then he backs away as point guards start their drives. And the reason why the Bulls want to do this is they're trying to prioritize containing those ball handlers, and they will, like the Raptors, live with their defense being in rotation. That opens up the role, and Van Vliet had 9 assists because of this defensive strategy. That brings me to my next point, which is Jakob Poeltl is going to be massively, massively impactful in this game. If the Bulls are trying to take away Van Vliet, they're going to give up something else, and that something else is Poeltl in these short rolls. It's going to be similar to what the Warriors do with Draymond Green, where they have a lot of these 4-on-3 advantages. The thing about Pirtle is he's a really good passer, and also he's a great finisher against guys who are smaller. That's what's going to happen. So I think Pirtle's going to have a huge game if the Bulls don't change up this game plan, which I don't think they're going to do. Nick Nurse also tried to get Pirtle a bunch of touches on his ATO plays, and after timeouts, when he called a set play, there's a specific play that they ran quite frequently where Pirtle would get the ball at the elbow and have Fred VanVleet set a flex screen on the baseline. So keep an eye out for that. They're probably going to bring that back. Another really clever play that the Raptors ran to exploit what the Bulls were doing defensively, having Vucevic up so high, is to run the Spain pick and roll at the end of the first half. So normally the way you want to guard this is to drop your big man. So Vucevic wants to be back towards the basket so that he can't get screened. It's harder to screen someone when they're that close to the basket. But because he's so high up, away from the basket, he just got obliterated by this screen. It caused an opening for the Raptors to be able to score. So that's the film portion of this preview. Let's move on from the film and just do some really quick numbers. The Raptors mashed the Bulls on the offensive glass pretty much every time they played them. They're a top 3 offensive rebounding team. The Bulls are a good defensive rebounding team, but they just can't compete with the size of the Raptors. So that's going to be an edge for the Raptors again in this play-in game. Both teams also turn each other over a ton, so depending on who wins that turnover battle, that's who's going to win the possession battle. It's going to be tough to score. It's going to be whoever is diving for these loose balls, and it's going to be Gary Trent happens to make a ton of threes, or Fred VanVleet gets hot from 3. That could swing it. Overall, though, should be a very entertaining game.